Can you try again?
Can you
Yeah,
screen?
yeah.
Okay, I just want to check whether I shared the full screen or not. I'll try again.
Okay.
It should work.
Yeah, in the view option, there was a full screen. Yeah, it's now clear. Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay. So I'll stop share, and when you tell me, I can start.
Okay.
Hi, Sarita. How are you?
Hi, Dipankar. I'm doing good. We have lockdown now here.
Yeah, I mean, everywhere almost here also. Yeah.
It started this week. I mean, complete lockdown. Last week it wasn't, but this week it is a full lockdown.
What about students? I mean, are they?
We have sent most of them back again.
Okay.
So good afternoon, everyone. Of the Aries weekly seminar. Today we are happy to have Professor Sarita Vij. She is an expert in the field of star formation, interstellar medium, and galactic structure. Professor Sarita did her PhD from TIFR Mumbai. After that, she was a postdoctoral fellow at INF in Florence, and it is a beautiful Italian city, as you know. Then she led a DST project at IIT Madras between 2009 to 2010, and currently she is a professor at IIT Trivandrum. So let's welcome Professor Sarita Vij. And the floor is yours, and I will ping you after 40 minutes. So you can share in and start your presentation.
Thank you, Suvendu, and thanks to Aries for giving me this opportunity to present this colloquium, where I will be presenting some bit of my work at the area in which I'm working. So I'll just begin by sharing my screen first. Hope this is visible.
Yes.
Okay. So my the area in which I work is the massive star formation, and like any other field, it is once you start going into the details and many intricacies. So I will be talking about the early phases and some aspects of early phases that we have studied. So I will be giving a brief introduction in the beginning. Stars are the fundamental luminous units of the universe, as we all know, and stars, both low mass stars, massive stars. If you look at our galaxy, they are mostly found in the spiral arms. If you look at other galaxies also, now we are certain that they are located in those regions where the interstellar medium is present in abundant quantities. That is the spiral arms itself, and it is within these interstellar clouds that there are denser cores and within which these stars form. Now, in the interstellar medium, the most densest, coldest And large extinction component phase of a large extinction component is the molecular clouds. The masses of molecular clouds is of the order of 100 to around 10 million solar masses. And it has been found, as shown by the study by Shuba et al., which can be seen towards the right here, that if one calculates the surface density of the molecular gas and the star formation rate density, then there is a strong correlation between them, indicating that molecular clouds are the regions where these stars form. And in this case, for example, the star formation rate is calculated using the far ultraviolet, as well as which represents the unobscured stars, and the 24 micron emission, which is the re-radiated emission absorbed by the dust. So here is shown a picture of a galaxy NGC 5055, where one can see the atomic gas through H1. This is the molecular gas through CO, and this is the total gas component. And if one sees the star formation rate, this has been computed, for example, here using FUV. This is the embedded star formation rate, which is from the infrared, as shown here. And this is the total star formation rate. So as one can see, there is a strong correlation between the total star formation rate density and the molecular gas surface density. Now, if one looks at molecular clouds themselves, this in detail, these represent an intricate network of filamentary structures, and people have tried to understand why it is in the form of these filamentary structures, and simulations have also been done. And one of the simulations shown here scale flows which collide. This is one such simulation where they have shown that when it cools down, then it depends on the speed of the collision, and the speed of the collision decides how much later the star formation will occur in these filamentary structures. And these filaments now we know are omnipresent and irrespective of the star forming content. That is, you can have filaments where star formation is occurring, as well as there are filaments with hubs and networks without any star formation content. And these filaments are typically of 1 parsec or longer. And here, for example, is shown, this is the simulations where one can see the column density map. And this is the slow flow, and this is for the fast flow. And this is the column density, and this is the width of that line, turbulent origin. Now, this is a column density map of Aquila, where one can see overlaid on top are the locations of the young stellar objects, that is the stars in their very early phases. And as one can see, these are located in the densest regions of this filamentary network. Now, coming to the star formation process itself, what we know today about the star formation process is mostly based on observations of low mass stars. And we are able to observe this mostly because this low mass star formation is a very extended process. It's a long process, and the various phases or evolutionary phases we can see because over time the molecular cloud dissipates. So broadly, this is the evolutionary sequence, where within the molecular clouds, there are dense cores and clumps, which in turn can undergo gravitational collapse, also known as the class 0 phase, is shown here. And at the center, as a protostar develops, if there is some initial rotation which is present, then it leads to the formation of an accretion, protostellar accretion disk, and there could be protostellar outflows and jets also, which are given off. This is represents the class 1 phase, which is shown here. And over time, this envelope dissipates, and you are left with the disk and a pre-main sequence star moving towards the main sequence, that is shown by the class 2 phase. And finally, you have the class 3 phase, where you have a debris disk and the central main sequence star. This, of course, the evolutionary phases, as we understand here, can be observationally determined using the spectral energy distributions. This is the class 0 phase, and this is the class 1, class 2, class 3 phase. And these classes, these are the classes of the young stellar objects according to the evolution. And this classification is mostly based on the spectral energy, the spectral index in the mid-infrared, because this is where there is a drastic change in the slope of the SED. Now, if one looks, this is of course for Loma star formation, which is relatively well understood, although there are many details which are yet to be filled in. The case of massive star formation is more difficult in the sense that there are observational difficulties in observing the early phases of massive star formation. That is because these are found deeply embedded in molecular clouds, and they evolve relatively quite fast compared to the Loma stars. So all the evolutionary phases which can be seen for the Loma stars, it's very difficult to observe them for Hima stars. So whether they go through the same phases as the Loma stars is not yet fully certain. But as we will see, observationally, people have tried to come up with an evolutionary sequence which is similar to the case of Loma stars. So as I said, there are observational difficulties, and one of the reasons for that is that these stars are rare, because according to the empirical initial mass function, one would not expect high mass stars to form during the process of fragmentation. And when I say massive stars, I mean stars of mass greater than 8 to 10 solar masses. From the theoretical perspective also, from what we know about Loma star formation and using simplistic assumptions, we come across a problem which is known as the radiation pressure problem. According to this, the radiation, once the star reaches the main sequence, it should give off copious amounts of UV photons, and this radiation would then stop the accretion from the envelope and the disk, and therefore the star should not undergo further accretion, and therefore the buildup of mass in the star would not occur. So one would not expect high mass stars to be present, and this is known as the radiation pressure problem. And it is, for simplistic considerations, one can show that the mass to luminosity relation for this to occur would be greater than 1000 times solar mass to solar luminosity, which typically corresponds to 8 to 10 solar masses. But then we know that massive stars do exist in nature, and so there has to be a solution around this problem. And one way that researchers have tried to overcome this radiation pressure problem is to think more in terms of enhanced accretion rates, because in the case of massive stars, it is anticipated that if one has enhanced accretion rate, then it can overcome the radiation pressure and still proceed with the accretion. In addition, during the early phases, there are outflow cavities, and it is possible that radiation could escape through that, while the accretion can continue to happen through the disk. And in case of high mass stars, therefore, people are actively trying to determine the accretion rates very accurately, but these are quantities which are not very easy to measure. But in some cases, they have found relatively high accretion rates, although there is active research still going on here. From the observational perspective, as I said, compared to Loma stars, there have been other observational other signposts, observational signposts that people have used in order to determine the evolutionary phase of massive stars. And these signposts include using dust continuum emission, infrared emission, molecular line emission, and therefore from that the properties of the associated gas, whether there is an infall or outflow, whether the measures are observed there, whether one sees radio continuum emission, as well as the size and density of these regions. So based on this, broadly, they can be categorized into starless cores, protostellar cores, or hypercompact H2 regions. But if one wants to go into slightly more details, this is what one sees. This is the cold collapsing core, where one can see ices and see molecules like CO, CO2, and CS, etc. And it is undergoing gravitational collapse. Once the protostar develops, it heats up the surrounding gas and can give off jets. And this surrounding gas will have certain chemical signatures because it warms up, and this is known as a hot molecular core. Then you can also have once since it's a massive star, it will, once it reaches the main sequence phase, it will give off UV photons which can ionize the regions around it. And in the very early phases, when it just ionizes a small region around it, that is known as hypercompact H2 region. These are smaller and have very high number densities. And as the H2 region expands, it becomes an ultra compact H2 region, and then it becomes an H2 region, compact H2 region, and so on, extended H2 region with OB associations seen in between. So the SCT of the regions also correspondingly evolve according to the processes that occur within. Now, the star formation process by itself is a very tempestuous process. And there are many processes, physical processes that are in play here. For example, gravity, turbulence, rotation, radiation, magnetic field, thermodynamics. And one needs to understand the processes with initial conditions. What's the nature of the initial conditions, and which physical processes play a more important role under which physical conditions, initial conditions. So the exact process, as I mentioned, of massive star formation is not very clear, and people are actively trying to understand the stages at which the collapse happened, the fragmentation happened, and all these have received an impetus through observations with ALMA. An additional difficulty is that these massive stars are formed always accompanied by cluster members of lower mass stars. So stars to look at the revolutionary phases becomes very difficult. And the fact that it is a tempestuous process is emphasized, that in star forming regions, we always see bubbles, shells, pillars, indicating a lot of violent activity around this region. Now, these are the, while we talked about the processes that go into star formation, the process of star formation itself can create a feedback for the ambient molecular cloud, and this can either inhibit or assist in further star formation. And it has been found that stars form on timescales much longer than the free fall timescales. They could suggest that it is a very slow and inefficient process. And this is only of a few percent in giant molecular clouds and about few tens of percent in molecular clouds. And if one wants to really understand the process of star formation, one must not only consider the initial conditions and the physical processes that are in play, but also consider the feedback mechanisms in order to understand the star formation in its entirety. Here, for example, is shown the feedback process, feedback caused by stellar winds from a cluster of stars, a cluster of massive stars. And as the massive stars evolved due to the powerful stellar winds that it gives off, one finds that there are these channels which are produced. And over time, the gas from the clump or the core is then, the density is reduced as the gas is channeled out from these regions which are created by low density regions which are created by the stellar winds. And as one can see over time, one can see this kind of elongated illuminated globules. One can see these illuminated globules which are seen here, which are very much reminiscent of the bright rimmed globules seen towards the massive star forming regions. And this is one of the feedback mechanisms. There are other feedback mechanisms and I will be talking just very briefly about them. For example, this is an image of the quintuplet cluster where one can see the cluster, the associated nebula, and there's a shock front associated with it. Due to the stellar winds, there is further structures which are created all along. And the other feedback mechanisms that are in play, that come into play, is the photoionization, which is the ionization of the surrounding medium by the ONB stars, which give off copious amounts of UV photons. We already talked about the stellar winds. Then there is radiation pressure, and the jets and outflows themselves also have very high velocities. They can produce shocks and heat the ISM. Then there are other processes like accretion heating, which can heat the dust grains and therefore the gas in the vicinity. And if one looks at massive stars, and most of these feedback mechanisms are larger for massive stars. So the massive stars can evolve and finish its lifetime, leading to a supernova explosion even before the low mass stars have entered into the main sequence phase. So therefore, it is important to consider all these processes when one is talking or understanding star formation in a molecular cloud. And the massive stars have a more profound effect because most of these effects is order of magnitude larger for massive stars, orders of magnitude larger for massive stars as compared to the low mass objects. So this, for example, shows the gas motion near a cluster. Here, the image that is shown, this is of course of the cluster G286.21. And this is the optical image where one can see the cluster and the associated nebula very clearly. What is seen as a movie is the gas motion and the velocities of the gas. From the pink, it is moving from 15 kilometers per second to 24. And one can see that molecular gas exists in all at all the boundaries of this region, where the gas has not been ionized and has not been ionized and is not affected by the star formation process. And these motions are controlled. The motion of these gas can be analyzed, and we know that they are controlled by gravity, turbulence, and wind and radiation pressure. Now, I will be from this, I will move on to some of the recent studies that we have done, and I will begin with infrared dark cloud. And the first infrared dark cloud that I would like to talk about, and this is the only infrared dark cloud I'll be talking about. I'll be talking about different aspects of star formation that we have investigated in recent years. And this infrared dark cloud is G333.73. As one can see, this is an elongated molecular cloud. We call it infrared dark cloud because here the density is so high that it shows extinction even at mid-infrared bands. This, of course, is the images in the far infrared in the submillimeter, where this gas, which is dark in mid-infrared, starts to emit, and one can see the emission clearly here. This is the emission, coal dust emission, and 1.2 mm. So this emission, this is dust emission, of course, and this dust emission is a very good proxy for the molecular gas, because it is optically thin and is not riddled by optical effects. So one can use this dust emission in order to understand the details about the molecular cloud. So here in this elongated molecular cloud, we actually could segregate around 10 clumps, and we looked at we investigated the properties of each of these clumps, because each of these clumps would give rise not only to one star, but a cluster of stars. It has the potential to give rise to a collapse and give rise to a cluster of stars. And C1 and C2, for example, are shown here. Here we have taken the spectral energy distribution and fitted with a modified black body, and we to get an estimate of the temperature and column density, which are listed here, and we can also estimate the masses. Now, C1 and C2 are the brightest clumps in this region, and that's why it's shown here. But all the properties of the clumps broadly are listed here. The masses are from 100 to 1,500 solar masses. The total mass of the entire cloud is around 5,000 solar masses. The temperature is around 14 to 25 Kelvin. And this, in addition to looking at the clump average properties, we also looked at the variation in column density and dust temperature by fitting every pixel, by combining all the maps at different wavelength bands and fitting every pixel with a gray body SED in order to determine the column density and dust temperature at each region in the image. This is the column density map of the region. As one can see, the column density is highest towards the very interior of the filamentary dark cloud. And if one looks at the temperature, then the temperature is highest towards these two clumps, which is C1 and C2. Of the order of 20 to 25 Kelvin. We also looked using mid and near infrared. We selected young stellar objects using color and color magnitude diagrams, and these are plotted here in order to understand the star formation activities. But there were a number of clumps which did not have stars, and for this we have estimated what is the probability of it, what is the most massive star that this clump can form. For this, what goes into consideration is the star formation efficiency, that is what percent of molecular gas is, what percent of the gas is converted to stars, as well as a certain IMF is taken into consideration. And we find that the star formation potential of these starless clumps is that is in terms of the most massive star it can form is of the order of 3 to 10 solar mass, that is intermediate to high mass stars. What this means is that each of the clumps is capable of forming high mass stars. And this is an 8 micron emission, as I mentioned, which is a mid-infrared. And here what you see is the high extinction region, which you can see here. What is in the black is the bright emission regions, and therefore which are actively forming stars, which is clump C1 and C2. We also looked at the gas cloud associated with this infrared dark cloud, the gas motions. And here, for example, again is the 8 micron emission in the background. And what you're seeing here is the CO emission, that is this cloud is emitting. And when we looked at the position velocity diagram, that is when we looked at the, for example, along AB, we do not see any, we looked at the velocities of gas as we are moving from A to B. That is shown by this curve here. We see that the velocities are not changing much. But on the other hand, when we are moving from C to D, we see that there is a change. These are the position velocity diagram. We see that there is a change in velocity as we are moving from one end of the cloud to the other end. This is also evident from this picture here. As you can see, this edge is much more has much more has lower velocity as compared to this. So this is a large scale velocity gradient that we are seeing across this infrared dark cloud, and this infrared dark cloud is of the order of 7 parsec, which means there's a large scale velocity gradient across the cloud. Now, why would this happen? There are two possibilities. One is that the cloud itself, this filament itself could be rotating. And the other possibility is there is accretion happening along the flow. And both these aspects have been seen towards IRDCs. And we did some simple calculations to show that if one considers the rotation, then the rotational energy to the gravitational energy is given by this expression, and we find a value which is close to the breakup speed for rotating clouds, and therefore we think that that is, if it were close to breakup speed, it should have broken up. But we therefore think that the other possibility option is the other alternative about accretion is more plausible, and using this velocity gradient, when we calculated the accretion rate that would happen, and that is of the order of 4.6 10⁻³ solar mass per year, and using again some simplistic considerations, and therefore have been seen, observed and seen towards other IRDCs. We therefore think that accretion is more plausible reason for this large scale velocity gradient in this infrared dark cloud. Then we looked at, if you look at the star forming activity towards the clump C1, there is radio and contours here. This radio emission, if one looks at high resolution emission near the peak, one sees that it is in the form of shell, and this is probably because of the stellar winds from the massive stars. And towards S2, that is towards the clump C2, there is a very compact emission. This would indicate that S1 obviously is more evolved as compared to S2. Also, the direction of the large-scale emission from S1 is in perpendicular to the direction of elongation. That is along the direction of the where the densities are lower. That is, H2 regions are expected to expand where the densities are lower, and this is what we see here. In the opposite, in the perpendicular direction, we have a higher density gradient, and therefore the gas is not able to expand out. Further, what we see is, we also looked at this, I'm not going to all the results towards some molecular species, for example, HCO+, and we find the signatures of, this is an optically thick profile with self-absorption feature seen here. And we see that the blue peak is higher than the red peak, indicating a blue symmetry. This is indication of infall that is occurring within this region. We do not have the molecular cloud molecular observations in various species for other regions. We have only towards S1, so we could analyze only that. Now, if one comes towards S2, one sees that the emission is very compact. Again, we see it has a cometry shape, and this cometry shape is consistent with the fact that towards the northeast, one sees a high density region sitting here. So this is some of the star formation activity which we probed in this molecular cloud, which is the infrared dark cloud, which is the birthplace of massive stars. Now, we also, I will go on to another region of interest, which is the study of protoclusters. That is, in each clump, for example, you can form a group of stars or a cluster. So if one looks at the in the early phase, how would the what would be the properties of this protocluster? So in this region, that is IRAS 18511 plus 0146, we study the gas and dust properties protostar, and it is a very bright protostar, for example, and it is deeply, all these objects here are deeply embedded, and we have investigated them by using the Very Large Telescope and the NTT. And here, for example, is the Spitzer image showing the various protocluster, showing the various members of this protocluster. And if one sees the radio emission, very compact radio emission on high frequencies was observed only towards two of the sources, towards S7 and S11, and therefore we think these two are the most massive objects, protostellar objects, and as compared to the others. On the other hand, it is even possible that the other objects are in very early phases of evolution. When we carried out the near-infrared spectroscopy, we found that these two objects show bracket gamma emission, whereas the other objects show a rising SED, but almost featureless SED, featureless continuum in the near-infrared, which is typical of young stellar objects. We also observed this in mid-infrared using the very large telescope, and in order to understand if there is any other emission or other sources, which we are able to get even younger sources. And what we found was that while we are able to see most of these sources towards S11, that is G5, we found that there is a region which is showing emission only in PAHs. So all these components were also studied in studied in mid-infrared to understand the nature of the dust in the immediate vicinity. So we looked at the silicate absorption features, and here are shown the silicate absorption features for the cluster members. This is for S11, which has dominant PAH emission. And from this silicate absorption features, we get the optical depth, and from the optical depth, we can estimate the extinction towards the line of sight of this cloud. This because it is the only region which has such high visual extinctions after the galactic center, as determined from the silicate features. And in this region, it is believed that these extinctions, the values are very high that we get. And this is probably because there is a diffuse cloud along the line of sight. So if we remove the effects of the interstellar medium, this is the visual extinction that we get, which is associated with the molecular cloud. When we looked at the features here, we also observed, when we looked at the silicate features very carefully, we observed that there are indications of crystalline nature of the silicates, as well as certain ice features. And we analyzed some of them. I'm not going into those details. Since S7 is the brightest object here, we wanted to see from the radio emission what kind of object it is, and from the radio emission we were able to determine its spectral index, and this spectral index is of the order of plus 0.6. And what this figure here tells us is what they have done, this researchers, Tanaka and others, is they have compared the bolometric luminosity with the radioluminosity. Bolometric luminosity estimated independently, and using these two, they have tried to estimate what stage of evolution it is. The solid line here indicates the H2 regions, and what is shown as dotted line here indicates the outflow confined H2. The protostellar object is a wind type source. It has stellar winds, and the H2 region is confined to that outflow cavity near the protostellar object. And they have estimated a number. They have looked at a number of objects. They have considered theoretical sources. And if we consider our object, which is S7, we find that it lies here. If we calculate the bolometric luminosity and radioluminosity, this would indicate that this is in a very early stage of evolution, when there is a small H2 region, but it is confined to the outflow. Now I'll go over to other studies that we have carried out. This is a molecular cloud, which again, this molecular cloud is G351.7 minus 1.2. Here, this red indicates the coal dust emission, and this blue indicates the K-band image, that is the near infrared emission. One can see that there is a region of low density which is surrounded by high density, and in fact this low density region is where there is a cluster of stars, as I will show in the next slide, and surrounding this is the high density region. These three clumps are the brightest, which are the most active clumps, and there are other clumps elsewhere which also show signatures of star formation. For example, this clump is C4, which is shown here. And this is the schematic of what we think could be happening in this molecular cloud. This contours here indicate the radio emission. And then we find 18 clumps in different evolutionary phases. And we have also looked at, we have plotted the mass and luminosity of these clumps. We have estimated the mass using the dust emission again, and we have determined their luminosity. And from the mass and luminosity from SETs, using the mass luminosity plot, we find that there are 4 active clumps. So you see the solid line here. This segregates the region which is envelope accretion, envelope clearing phase from the actively accreting phase. So the region below the solid line is the actively accreting phase, and this is the envelope clearing phase from based on models by Molinari et al. 2008. And we find that there are these 4 active clumps which are here, as compared to the other clumps which are either quiescent, that is not yet formed stars, or in an intermediate phase. And this is the cluster in the central region. We also carried out spectroscopy to see the, here for example is shown the bracket gamma emission across this nebular region. You can see how the bracket gamma emission varies across the region when a slit is placed in this direction. Now, if one looks at the ionized gas emission alone, then the ionized gas emission displays a cometry kind of morphology. So it has a head and then a low high density head and a low density tail. High density is there's a sharp density gradient here. Now there are 2 alternative options. We were wondering what can cause this kind of cometry shape, and there are 2 scenarios which are proposed. First is the Bow-Shock model, where a massive star moves into the molecular cloud, and as it is moving into the molecular cloud, it creates a bow-shock in front of it, giving rise to this kind of cometry feature. And in this case, the motion of the gas would be in the following way. As the star is moving up, the ionized gas is moving with it. On the other hand, there is the Champagne flow model, according to which is the result of an asymmetrical expansion of H2 region within and outside the cloud. Within the cloud, there's a higher density gradient. And as it is in the higher density gradient, then you will see a sharper density gradient towards the inside the cloud as compared in the opposite direction. And in this case, the velocities of the gas will be higher towards a lower density region. It will move faster here. And there are also hybrid models. So we wanted to test this, and therefore we carried out radio recombination lines, because with radio recombination lines, you can get the velocities of the ionized gas. And we compared it to the velocity of the molecular cloud in this region. And this is what we found. This is the H172 alpha radio recombination line, which we carried out with GMRT. This is the intensity. This is the moment 1, which is the velocity. And this is the velocity dispersion, which is the moment 2 map. Now, across the moment 1 map, across this, as you can see that there is a density gradient in the moment 1 map. So we placed the slits along this region and analyzed the spectra, radio recombination line spectrum, and we find that there is a systematic increase in velocity as we move from C1 towards the C2. But if you compare the molecular gas shows velocities which are the same as the LSR velocities. This gives credence to the Champagne flow model as opposed to the Bow-Shock model. Now, if one, we also found other interesting things here. When we looked at the radio spectral index using 610 and 325 megahertz on GMRT, we saw non-thermal emission. While we did see non-thermal emission towards the head, we saw and thermal emission here, but we saw a lot of non-thermal emission towards the tail. So this is the 325 megahertz map. This is the 1280 megahertz map. And as you can see from the 325 megahertz map, there seems to be some kind of connection. This is the region of our interest, which is shown here. Star forming region and 17258, and this star forming, both these star forming regions seem to have some kind of diffuse emission at lower frequencies. So keeping this in mind, we again apply emission. And when we looked at the supercosmos H alpha emission, we found something very interesting. Just like this vaguely appears to be like a ring with a broken structure in the north west, we found that that nestled within the radio emission is this optical H alpha emission with a similar broken ring structure. So this now piqued our curiosity, and we were really interested in finding out why this is so, because the H2 regions are pretty far off, and this is something which is kind of different and related or not related to these two. And here, therefore, you have thermal and non-thermal emission present. So with the GMRT, this is what we got with the wideband. We carried out these observations, and as one can see that from 321 to 480 megahertz, we created maps, and then we looked at the emission towards identified apertures to look at various parts of this cloud, which we also call the broken shell. And then we looked at the spectral energy distribution, and we found that towards the H2 regions, the spectral energy distribution, the spectral indices are positive, which is indicative of thermal emission, whereas it is negative towards the other end, indicating that there's a lot of large-scale non-thermal emission here. Since it is also in the form of a ring, there is a plausibility that there is a supernova remnant here. Now, when we looked at the near infrared images, just outside that optical this, and we found that it can be fit with a, we took this region at a different wavebands, found it. We find we need to fit a double dust temperature model to this with temperatures of 31 Kelvin and a hotter dust of 153 Kelvin. And this kind of studies have been done around other supernova remnants, and the hotter dust in this case can arise. The hotter dust that we see in this arc can arise either due to collisional heating by plasma or radiative excitation. So all these evidences now point towards this being a supernova remnant candidate as well, because of the large scale non-thermal emission, the fact that it is also spherical in shape, and the optical emission. So this is a color composite of this in different wavebands. One can see the radio, optical, as well as the infrared. Now, then let us see if we can see some gas which is expanding, because if it is supernova expansion, supernova remnant, it should have a associated expanding gas. So we had GMRT with us, and therefore we decided to see if we can see some H1 emission associated with the shell around this region. And we carried out H1 observations again with GMRT, and these are our results. So towards the two H2 regions, we see absorption, whereas in the other regions, spectrum that we see, and we see a high velocity component here. Now, if we see the LSR corresponding to the LSR of 35 kilometers per second, and velocities higher with that, then we see some diffuse emission around this shell. So there seems to be some diffuse emission associated with the region outside this shell here, which is probably expanding. It's at relatively higher velocities, not too high. But what was piqued us again, what was interesting was this high velocity component. So to be certain that this high velocity component is associated with this, we did not find with the background emission. We also look at the galactic all sky survey of H1 carried out by Parkes telescope. And again, we found that it is a high velocity component. This is the background in another part of the sky. So it was certain that there is some high velocity component which is present towards this supernova remnant. So we tried to see this high velocity component is of the order of the velocities of order of 45 kilometers per second or greater. And then, and if you look from the point of view of the rotation curve of the galaxy, then this high velocity component is not expected to be present, because according to the rotation curve, one is expected to have velocities from minus 200 to plus 30 kilometers per second, and this definitely plus 35 kilometers per second, and this definitely was larger than that. And when we looked at this emission, we saw this high velocity emission, we started to see some kind of elongated and collimated emission, which if you can see this very carefully here, and this is we began to see a very collimated kind of H1 jet. So this was again very interesting. Towards the peak of the emission, there is a Fermi-Lat source, which is a coincidence. But the first, of course, view of ours was probably this is a protostellar jet, but having such high velocities, there is no protostellar jet of such large scale. This is really large scale of the order of 7 parsecs in H1. And there are, if you see towards the peak or where the jet is, we did not see any near infrared emission or any dust emission which is associated with star forming region. So we think therefore that this is associated with the supernova remnant. And when we looked in the literature, we found that there were few cases H1 emission, H1 kind of, not exactly jets. We did not find too much into literature about H1 jets, but we saw that towards certain black holes and neutron stars, there was some H1 emission which is entrained by the relativistic jet. There are very few of them, though, very few such studies, though. So we therefore think this possibly excited by the progenitor of the supernova. And in one case, for example, bipolar H1 emission was seen from a central compact object, and a pulsar was discovered there. We therefore went and again went to GMRT to look for pulsar, but we did not detect a radio pulsar up to a 10 sigma limit of around 0.18 millijansky. So that does not mean that there is no compact object here. It possibly only means that it is radio quiet. What we need to further do is now look at other wavelength bands, high energy emission, probably X-ray, to be able to get further insight. But the life is complicated here because there is a molecular cloud also here, and this molecular cloud can cause large extinction towards these regions. So finally, I come to protostellar jets. So from the jets associated with which we found in molecular cloud, I move to some of the recent work that we have been doing with protostellar jets.
You have 5 minutes left.
Okay, I'll take 5 to 10. So protostellar jets from massive stars can also affect the surrounding molecular cloud and can cause turbulence. For example, collimated protostellar outflows are found to be more efficient at driving carried out by Nakamura et al. Here the color scale is the density, is the column density, whereas the arrows represent the velocity vectors of the outflow. So protostellar outflow therefore can impact the surrounding medium in very strange ways. And for example, we know that the Herbig-Haro objects are are knots of gas which are created due to the shocks produced when this protostellar jets move into the ambient medium. So the jet that we studied was in radio, and this is a protostellar jet from a very massive star. Usually Herbig-Haro objects are seen around low mass stars, in some cases massive stars, but this protostellar jet does not shows only 2 Herbig-Haro objects, but when one looks at it in radio, a very elongated jet is seen. So this is one of the most collimated protostellar jet from the massive star and extends up to 18 parsecs. So it's a very powerful jet. It's the fastest known jet also, with 600 to 1400 kilometers per second. Now at the central object is obscured because it is very embedded and very young, but it is believed to be of a B0 type. And when people carried out radio observations using PLA at higher frequencies, they found a spectral indices which is of the order of -0.3. Then later people also went about and carried out polarization measurements, like Carrasco Gonzalez and others carried out polarization measurements, and very close to the jet they could detect polarization, indicating or confirming the presence of synchrotron emission in this region. So since we know that synchrotron emission is present here,
ईयरफोन्स लगा के भी मुझे आवाज आ रही है.
I think, yeah, I can hear. Okay, so when one looks at this protostellar, the radio emission close to the jet, we were wondering whether with GMRT at low frequencies we can segregate the synchrotron emission more clearly, because at higher frequencies it's possible that because of the beam dilution, the non-thermal and the thermal emission part would get mixed and the spectral index get flattened. So with GMRT, we were able to detect this jet, and which is shown here. This is the image, and these are the jet at 325, 610, and 1300 megahertz. This represents the VLA emission. We also found that the jet is variable because when we tried to combine the 610 megahertz observations taken 1 decade earlier, we could not reconcile the SED. So we had to do the measurements again at 610 megahertz, and then we found consistent fluxes in terms of spectral flux densities, and we could estimate the spectral indices. So what we found is that if you look at this table, these spectral indices are from VLA, but with GMRT, we were able to get much steeper spectral indices, indicating that we are looking only at the synchrotron emission associated with the various knots along with the protostellar jet. Now, again, buoyed by this, we decided to find out where the non-thermal emission is, where the non-thermal emission is coming from. So we know that high velocity jets, it is believed that high velocity jets produce strong shocks at termination points, but particularly for this jet, Rodrigues Kamenetsky again carried out very high resolution observations. And what they found was that this is the spectral index max, this is the image from the 3 bands. What they found is that the non-thermal emission is mostly coming from the edges of the jet or the termination points where interacting with the interstellar medium. And towards the central regions, you have the thermal jet. And there are only a handful of jets where non-thermal protostellar jets where non-thermal emission is seen. Now, this is of importance. People are also looking at this as a possible source of cosmic ray, because these shocks could accelerate the thermal electrons across the shock front, and that could be a possible reason, possible source of galactic cosmic rays also. Of course, the number of such jets known is very few. Now, if one looks at modeling and trying to understand this, there are models of the thermal jets in literature, again, which they are analytical models. The best known one is by Reynolds of thermal jet in 1989, where he did some simplistic assumptions about it being a very narrow jet, and based on that, he estimated what the spectral indices of a thermal jet would be like for various cases of how the density changes and so on. We therefore decided to model the case of both thermal and non-thermal emission from the jet. And for this, we considered a simplistic model here. This is the jet. This is around the protostellar object. This is where the jet starts from. The region 2 indicates the emission where the region where there is only thermal emission, and all the shaded region represents the region where there is both thermal emission and a fraction of electrons are accelerated to very high velocities, giving rise to the synchrotron emission. In addition, so we calculated that along a given line of sight, what the emission would be like, the combined effect of the emission from these 3 regions by using the absorption and emission coefficients appropriately, and these represents the integrated intensities from the 3 regions, and when you add it up all up together, we can get the estimated flux density. In other words, we are able to we can estimate the flux densities using this simplistic model, but there are also complications because there are a number of parameters here like density, temperature, ionization fraction, opening angle, and so on, and all these vary radially. So we have taken that into consideration, and we have also looked at the variation of ionization fraction laterally across the jet. So this, so we have done the simplistic calculations. With this one, we can therefore compare with observations. And this is my last slide. So these are some of the results that these are early results. So if this is the jet schematic, this which is here, the jet, as we are looking towards the jet, what is shown in this colored plot is the frequency as a function of projected jet length, the flux density as a function of frequency and projected jet length. When you say projected jet length, that means we take this small region across this jet, integrate it, and that at a given frequency, that 1 pixel or 1 point in this plot. So one can see how across the jet, and across the frequency, how the emission changes. The solid line here indicates the turnover frequency. As you can see, the spectrum at different projected lengths is expected to be different depending on the various parameters that we have assumed. We also now used this model. We worked this model on a grid of parameters, and for that, then we compared them to few observations, observations of protostellar jet, which show non-thermal emission, and we are able to get relatively good matches to the observations. In this way, it will be possible for us to get the parameters of the jet based on the spectral energy distribution observational point. So this is still a work in progress. And with this, I come to the end of my talk. These are some of the things that we have been doing. We know that the massive star formation occurs deep within molecular clouds, and we need to understand the role of initial conditions and physical processes during the birth of massive stars. And we need to also include the effect of feedback if you want to understand that process. And we looked at some of the cases that we have studied recently of infrared dark clouds, of clump activities, looking at environment of a protocluster, and looking at supernova remnant, associated H1 jet, and we also saw we are also trying to look at non-thermal emission being generated from protostellar jets. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention.
So let's thank Professor Sarita Vij for such a wonderful talk. And now we have time. So I see a few hands there. So you have to, yeah, Indranil, can you unmute yourself and ask the question? Hello, Indranil, can you unmute yourself? Yes.
Shubhendu, the connection
Yeah.
is very bad. I'm just writing it, okay,
Okay.
in the chat box. You can ask someone else to ask a question, and I'm writing
Yes.
it.
I saw there are more hands, but now it.
Yes, Sivandu.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Saurabh. So just I would like to thank Sarita for such a nice talk. I hope all the students who are working in staff formation
Thank you, Saurabh. Can you hear me? I seem.
Saurabh, it seems there is some connection problem, so we cannot hear you clearly.
But thank you, Saurabh. I hope you're feeling much better now.
So
yeah, now I can hear
I think the problem, the internet problem is there. So shall we take questions?
Of course, where we're staying has some network issue. There's clogging there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I see more hands there. So Arpan, can you please unmute yourself and ask the question? Arpan? Okay, so let's go to. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Arpan sends.
Hello,
Yeah, we can hear you. Yes, I can see your question also in the chat box.
Okay.
Okay, so can I answer the questions too?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So I think Indranil is asking, what is the possibility of star formation by a supernova in a molecular cloud, or for that matter, YSO jet, as they will be present? Okay, so we all think that supernova explosions should trigger and give rise, but I don't think there are conclusive evidence of star formation being triggered by supernova remnant, although we think it is. I mean, there are no observational concrete evidences in that matter. In our case, in the molecular cloud, for example, when we did a simple expansion model, we feel based on simplistic assumptions, we find that it is very unlikely that the supernova remnant could have triggered star formation in the molecular cloud that we are studying. And but we don't know for certainty, because again, simplistic assumptions go into picture. We calculated the ages of the H2 regions and so on. And now coming to protostellar jets, there are cases, this I know of, protostellar jets compressing cores, for example. So if you have because you have a lot of clumps and cores, the protostellar jet, as it moves out, there is a case in Orion where people have found that this jet actually compresses the core, where there are indications that it's a hot molecular core, which means that it is in a protostellar evolutionary phase, and it is thought that jet is probably the reason why the core is there is star formation occurring there. Okay, I hope that answers the question.
So,
okay, typical kinetic energy measures for these jets. Okay, I don't know the numbers offhand, so I cannot tell right now. So that is something I don't have the numbers now. I think we did these calculations, but right now I don't have the numbers. Okay.
Yeah, there's a
Now-
question from Arfan. You can take.
Yes.
if you
Why
want.
is the star formation sigma in star formation rate correlated to CO? Why not with other molecules? Okay, H2 is the most abundant molecule, but you can't measure it. And when we are doing measurements, we do measurements. It is easier and faster to detect molecules which are abundant. But H2, because of its of its dipole properties, is not very well. You can't measure it very easily. You can't observe it very easily, and therefore we use the CO as a proxy for H2. Although you can also find regions where there is H2 and there is no CO, but overall, to a large extent, CO is kind of a proxy of molecular hydrogen. Now, if you talk about other molecules like HCO plus and so on, their abundance is much, much lower. So one can do even for those molecules, one should do, but it will require a really long integration time to be able to do these kind of measurements. As you can see, the plot which I showed was for a number of spiral galaxies. So if you want Shruba et al., if you want to do that kind of measurement with an alternate molecule, you need relatively long integration time. Okay.
And there is a
So-
question from Silva Sarkar also.
Yeah. So what is the source of magnetic field in molecular clouds? Okay, so there is magnetic field everywhere, but in the molecular clouds, they tend to get compressed. Okay, that's called, that's what we think would be happening. And particularly if you are having they tend to get compressed, and particularly if you are having, for example, a rotating cloud, you find that these magnetic fields, people have tried to measure the direction, and we think that near these protostars there should be a toroidal field. Now, what gives rise to a magnetic field? That's like probably a chicken and egg kind of problem. You have ions moving, which will produce magnetic field, and electric field, and a moving electric field can produce magnetic field. This is what I think. But yeah, that's what I would say.
So I have a query. What is the typical magnetic field in this molecular cloud? Some 3 microgauss or something?
Yes.
Okay,
It's very
okay.
low. It's low. And
Okay.
that is where the relative, 3 microgauss is interstellar.
Okay.
In these regions where you're seeing synchrotron emission, we find that is of the order of 200 to 300 microgauss. That is
Okay.
because, particularly near the Herbig-Haro objects, that is because we believe there could be a compression happening, and that is why possible. We don't know that yet. We would like to measure that.
Okay, and there's another question from Priyanka Jalan, the upper one. Why will be the accretion rate higher for massive stars? If you can read that question.
Where is this? I can't see.
At the top of first question. Okay, so she asked privately. So she asked why will be the accretion rate
Why does one expect accretion rate to be higher for massive stars?
stars? Yes.
Okay, so massive, we do not know. We needed to invoke that. We didn't start off with that. This is what I want to say. We didn't start off with that. We needed to invoke that because we wanted to understand the pressure. And now, of course, we come to the question of why it should be higher for massive stars. This is what the question is. So I don't think I know the answer to that, and I don't think people know the answer to that, because it is still not very certain that it is high in all the regions. We think it should be high to solve our problem, but whether it is really high, one needs to do a lot of survey and to be able to tell that it is high. In some regions, it has been found to be high, and we use those regions to say that probably this is how massive stars are formed. But if they are high, probably it has to do with the fact that the gravitational potential here is expected to be larger for massive stars as compared to lower mass stars. And maybe that is the reason why the accretion rate is high.
So you mean there is no correlation found spectroscopically, accretion rate and black hole mass, something like that?
Black hole.
Star massive star mass.
What people usually do is when they do accretion rate, they don't do accretion rate. They take the outflow rate and take a fraction of that as accretion rate. This is the standard way to do it. Okay, so you can now do 10% of that, and this is typically a ballpark number. It's very difficult to find out the accretion rate directly. You need to put in a lot of assumptions there anyway. So it is not certain.
Yeah.
No, but I did have black holes in my talk, so I think everybody is happy. I hope.
Okay, yeah. So if there are no more questions, then we can let's thank the speaker again, and
Okay, thank you very much. Too.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so we can let's meet again next week probably. And-
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Sarita, for coming online. We hope that we'll be able to invite you sometime here and have you face to
Yes.
face.
Thank you, because till now I have been trying to come to Aries for so long and it has not happened. Saurabh told me please come, but it didn't happen. And even earlier, I think there was an ASI meeting very long ago, and at the last moment it got cancelled for me. I'm really looking forward to coming to ASI. I think next year it may be close to Aries, and if we are coming there, hopefully.
Yes. Hopefully we'll have it in near Dehradun. So it's in Roorkee, IIT Roorkee. So from there you can travel.
Yeah, yes, I would like to. Okay. Thanks, then.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Yeah, bye.